In the shadowed corridors of corporate boardrooms and the hushed chambers where nations' fates are decided, a silent war wages every day. It is not fought with weapons or words alone, but with the most powerful force known to humanity, intelligence applied with surgical precision. This intelligence manifests not as mere academic knowledge, but as a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and the invisible levers that move the world. Marcus Chun understood this principle intimately as he sat across from the board of directors, their collective net worth exceeding the GDP of small nations. At 32, he had risen from obscurity to become the youngest CEO in the company's century-long history. The room fell silent as he began to speak, not because of his title, but because of something far more powerful, but quiet confidence that comes from having systematically destroyed every weakness within himself. "Gentlemen, ladies," Marcus began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "we stand at a crossroads not of market forces or economic trends, but of human psychology itself. The question before us is simple: will we remain followers of circumstances, or will we become architects of reality?" The transformation Marcus embodied had not happened overnight. It was the result of understanding and mastering what few people ever recognize, the 10 distinct stages of intelligence that separate those who lead from those who merely exist in the wake of others' decisions. Stage 1, Reactive Intelligence, the prison of circumstance. The vast majority of humanity operates at the first stage of intelligence, though they would violently deny this assessment if confronted with it. Reactive intelligence is characterized by a fundamental misunderstanding of causality. Individuals at this level believe that their circumstances create their reality, rather than recognizing that their responses to circumstances are what truly shape their lives. Sarah Williams exemplified this stage perfectly during her tenure as a middle manager at a technology firm. Every morning, she would arrive at the office carrying the weight of external events as if they were physical burdens. Market fluctuations affected her mood. Difficult clients ruined her entire day. Office politics consumed her thoughts and energy. She lived in a constant state of reaction, never recognizing that her emotional responses were choices rather than inevitable consequences. "I can't help how I feel," Sarah would often say, unknowingly articulating the core limitation of reactive intelligence. This belief system creates a prison where individuals see themselves as victims of forces beyond their control. They develop elaborate theories about luck, unfairness, and systemic problems to explain their lack of progress, never recognizing that their own mental frameworks are the true barriers to advancement. The psychological mechanism at work here is what researchers call external locus of control, the belief that outcomes are primarily determined by external factors rather than personal actions. This mindset creates a cascade of self-defeating behaviors. When challenges arise, reactive individuals focus on blame rather than solutions. When opportunities appear, they hesitate because they don't believe they have real agency in the outcome. When success occurs, they attribute it to luck, preventing them from learning and replicating the behaviors that led to positive results. Marcus remembered his own time in this stage with clinical detachment. Fresh out of university, he had blamed his slow career progression on office politics, on the economy, on his lack of connections. It was only when he encountered a mentor who shattered his comfortable illusions that he began to understand the true nature of his imprisonment. "You have convinced yourself that you are powerless," his mentor had told him with brutal honesty. "This conviction has become your reality not because it is true, but because you have made it true through your choices. Every moment you spend analyzing what others are doing to you is a moment stolen from analyzing what you could be doing for yourself." The transition from reactive to proactive thinking requires a fundamental shift in perception, one that most people resist because it eliminates their ability to blame external circumstances for their limitations. This resistance is not merely psychological, it is deeply neurological. The human brain is designed to conserve energy, and reactive thinking requires less mental effort than the constant vigilance and decision-making required for proactive thinking. Yet those who make this transition discover something remarkable: reality begins to bend around their intentions rather than their fears. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" they begin asking, "How can I use this?" Instead of seeking sympathy for their difficulties, they seek strategies for overcoming them. Instead of waiting for permission or perfect conditions, they create both through decisive action. Stage 2, Proactive Intelligence, the birth of agency. The second stage of intelligence represents humanity's first glimpse of true power, the recognition that thoughts create reality rather than merely reflecting it. Individuals who reach this level understand that their internal state determines their external experience, not the reverse. This realization marks the beginning of genuine leadership potential, though it is still far from its full expression. David Kumar embodied this transition during his transformation from a struggling sales representative to a regional director. The external circumstances of his life had not changed. He still faced rejection, difficult customers, and market challenges. However, his relationship with these circumstances underwent a complete metamorphosis. Where he once saw rejection as a personal failing, David began to recognize it as market research. Each no provided valuable information about customer needs, timing, or presentation approach. Where he once felt victimized by difficult customers, he began to see opportunities to demonstrate value and build stronger relationships. Where he once feared market challenges, he began to anticipate how these challenges would eliminate weaker competitors and create opportunities for those prepared to act. I realized that I had been living in a reactive trance, David later explained to his team. I thought the market was happening to me, but the truth was that I was happening to the market through every choice I made. Once I understood this, everything changed. The psychological foundation of proactive intelligence lies in what psychologists call internal locus of control, the belief that outcomes are primarily determined by personal choices and actions rather than external circumstances. This shift in perspective activates different neural pathways in the brain, literally rewiring the individual's relationship with reality. Proactive individuals develop what can be called responsibility, the ability to choose their responses to any situation rather than being controlled by automatic reactions. This capacity requires significant mental energy and constant practice, which explains why many people revert to reactive patterns during times of stress or challenge. The practical manifestations of proactive intelligence are immediately observable. Proactive individuals arrive at meetings with solutions rather than complaints. They volunteer for challenging assignments that others avoid. They invest time in developing skills that may not have immediate application but will provide long-term advantage. They build relationships before they need them and prepare for opportunities before they appear. However, proactive intelligence contains its own limitations and potential pitfalls. Many individuals at this stage develop what might be called heroic individualism, the belief that personal effort alone can overcome any obstacle. While this mindset generates impressive results in many situations, it can also lead to burnout, isolation, and a failure to recognize the importance of leverage and strategic thinking. Marcus had experienced this limitation firsthand during his early management years. His proactive approach had earned him rapid promotions, but he found himself working increasingly long hours while his impact seemed to plateau. He was solving problems faster than others could create them, but he was still playing by rules he had not written. I was like a master chess player who had memorized every opening and strategy, Marcus reflected, but I was still playing on someone else's board. True power doesn't come from playing the game better than others, it comes from being able to change the game itself. This realization pointed toward the next stage of intelligence development, one that would require abandoning the comfortable illusion that individual effort was the ultimate source of power. Stage 3, Strategic Intelligence. The science of leverage. Strategic intelligence represents the first stage where individuals begin to understand systems rather than merely responding to events within systems. This level of thinking involves the ability to see patterns across time and space, to identify leverage points where small actions can produce disproportionate results, and to design approaches that use existing forces rather than fighting against them. Elena Rodriguez demonstrated this level of intelligence during her transformation of a failing restaurant chain. Where others saw only declining revenue and increased competition, Elena saw a complex system of interconnected relationships, market forces, and human psychology. Her analysis revealed that the company's problems were not primarily operational but perceptual. Customers had developed negative associations with the brand that no amount of improved food quality or service could overcome. Rather than investing millions in traditional marketing or operational improvements, Elena implemented a strategy that seemed almost counterintuitive. She temporarily closed the worst-performing locations, used the savings to completely rebrand the remaining restaurants, and then gradually reopened the closed locations under the new brand. The result was that customers perceived the expansion as the growth of a successful new concept rather than the desperate recovery of a failing one. Most people see problems as things to be solved through harder work, Elena explained to her management team. Strategic thinking means recognizing that most problems exist because of flawed systems, and changing the system is often easier than fighting its results. Strategic intelligence requires a fundamental shift in temporal thinking. While reactive individuals focus on immediate consequences and proactive individuals plan for short-term outcomes, strategic thinkers operate with extended time horizons. They understand that today's actions create tomorrow's circumstances, and they design their decisions accordingly. This extended temporal perspective allows strategic thinkers to identify what economists call delayed gratification advantages, opportunities where accepting short-term costs or discomfort leads to disproportionate long-term benefits. They invest in relationships years before they need them, develop skills that have no immediate application, and position themselves in emerging markets before they become obviously profitable. The psychological foundation of strategic intelligence involves what cognitive scientists call systems thinking, the ability to perceive complex relationships between multiple variables rather than focusing on linear cause and effect relationships. This type of thinking requires significant mental energy and contradicts many intuitive human cognitive biases. For example, humans are naturally inclined toward what psychologists call fundamental attribution error, the tendency to explain others' behavior through character traits rather than situational factors. Strategic thinkers overcome this bias by recognizing that behavior is primarily a function of systems and incentives rather than individual character. This understanding allows them to predict and influence behavior by changing systems rather than trying to change people. Strategic intelligence also involves mastery of what military theorists call indirect approaches, achieving objectives through methods that appear unrelated to the desired outcome. Rather than attacking problems directly, strategic thinkers often solve them by addressing their underlying causes or by making the problems irrelevant through changed circumstances. Marcus had developed this capacity during his time as a regional manager, when he faced the challenge of improving performance in a division plagued by low morale and high turnover. Direct approaches, motivational speeches, performance incentives, disciplinary actions had all failed. Instead, Marcus implemented a seemingly unrelated change. He redesigned the physical workspace to encourage informal interaction between departments. The result was that employees began developing personal relationships across departmental boundaries, which led to increased collaboration, which led to better project outcomes, which led to increased job satisfaction, which led to reduced turnover and improved performance. The original problem was solved not by addressing it directly, but by changing the system that created it. I learned that the most powerful interventions often appear to have nothing to do with the problem you're trying to solve, Marcus later explained. Strategic thinking means understanding that everything is connected to everything else, and sometimes you have to push in the opposite direction to get where you want to go. However, strategic intelligence carries its own limitations. Many individuals at this stage become so focused on systems and leverage that they lose sight of human elements that cannot be systematized. They may develop a manipulative approach to relationships, viewing other people primarily as components in their strategic designs rather than as individuals with their own legitimate interests and autonomy. This limitation points toward the need for a higher level of intelligence, one that combines strategic thinking with genuine understanding of human psychology and motivation. Stage 4, Psychological Intelligence, the hidden curriculum. The fourth stage of intelligence involves deep understanding of human psychology and the ability to influence behavior through insight rather than force or manipulation. Individuals at this level recognize that all human action is driven by emotional needs and psychological patterns, and they develop sophisticated abilities to work with these patterns rather than against them. Robert Chen, no relation to Marcus, exemplified this level of intelligence in his role as a crisis management consultant. When called in to resolve a labor dispute that had paralyzed a manufacturing company for 6 months, Robert discovered that the apparent issues, wages, working conditions, and benefits, were symptoms of deeper psychological dynamics. Through careful observation and conversation, Robert learned that the workers felt disrespected and unheard by management, while management felt frustrated by what they perceived as unreasonable demands. The real conflict was not economic but psychological. Both sides needed to feel acknowledged and valued. Rather than negotiating specific terms, Robert designed a process that allowed both sides to feel heard and respected while working toward mutually beneficial solutions. He arranged for workers to present their concerns directly to the board of directors, which satisfied their need for acknowledgement, while also creating a forum for management to explain business realities in a context where workers felt respected enough to listen. Every conflict is really about unmet emotional needs, Robert explained to the company executives. Solve the emotional problem, and the practical solutions become obvious. Try to solve the practical problem while ignoring the emotional dynamics, and you'll create bigger problems than you started with. Psychological intelligence requires understanding what drives human behavior at the deepest levels. This includes recognizing that people's stated motivations are often quite different from their actual motivations, and that effective influence requires addressing actual rather than stated needs. For example, individuals may claim to want more money when what they really want is recognition and respect. They may resist change not because the change is inherently harmful, but because change represents a threat to their sense of identity or competence. They may engage in seemingly irrational behavior that makes perfect sense when viewed through the lens of their psychological needs and fears. The development of psychological intelligence requires abandoning several comforting illusions about human nature. Most people prefer to believe that others are rational actors who make decisions based on objective analysis of facts and consequences. Psychological intelligence reveals that human decisions are primarily emotional, with rational analysis used mainly to justify choices that have already been made on emotional grounds. This understanding can be profoundly unsettling, as it reveals the extent to which human behavior is predictable and influenceable. Many individuals who develop psychological intelligence experience a period of cynicism or depression as they recognize how easily people can be manipulated and how rarely human behavior is truly rational or autonomous. However, the highest expression of psychological intelligence involves using this understanding in service of others' genuine well-being rather than personal advantage alone. This requires developing what might be called ethical influence, the ability to help people satisfy their psychological needs in ways that also serve their long-term interests and the interests of others. Marcus had struggled with this transition during his development. His growing understanding of human psychology had initially made him more effective at getting what he wanted from others, but it had also made him increasingly cynical about human nature and isolated in his relationships. I became very good at reading people and pushing their psychological buttons, Marcus reflected. But I realized that this approach was ultimately self-defeating. People can sense when they're being manipulated, even if they can't articulate what's happening. Real influence comes not from psychological manipulation, but from helping people achieve what they actually want while also achieving what you want. This realization had led Marcus to develop what he called aligned influence, the practice of identifying situations where his goals and others' goals could be achieved through the same actions. This approach required more creativity and patience than manipulation, but it produced more sustainable and satisfying results for everyone involved. The limitation of psychological intelligence, even when applied ethically, is that it can become a sophisticated form of people-pleasing. Individuals at this stage sometimes become so focused on understanding and accommodating others' psychological needs that they lose sight of their own authentic goals and values. They may become skilled at helping others succeed while neglecting their own development and advancement. This pattern points toward the need for a higher level of intelligence, one that combines psychological insight with unwavering commitment to authentic personal vision and values. The fifth stage of intelligence represents a crucial integration point where individuals develop the ability to maintain psychological insight while remaining true to their own deepest values and vision. This stage is characterized by what might be called centered influence, the capacity to work effectively with others' psychological needs while never compromising one's own authenticity or core objectives. Jennifer Walsh discovered this balance during her tenure as the CEO of a technology startup. Her company faced a crisis when their primary investor threatened to withdraw funding unless the company pivoted away from its original mission toward a more immediately profitable but ethically questionable direction. The investor was a master of psychological manipulation, using a combination of fear, urgency, and personal flattery to pressure Jennifer into compliance. He knew exactly which buttons to push, Jennifer later recalled.
He praised my intelligence while questioning my business judgment.
He created artificial urgency while offering himself as the solution to problems he had helped create.
He was very sophisticated in his approach.
However, Jennifer had developed the psychological clarity to recognize these tactics while maintaining focus on her authentic goals. She understood that the investor's pressure was based on his own fears and needs rather than objective business analysis. She also recognized that compromising her company's mission would ultimately serve neither her interests nor his. Instead of either submitting to the pressure or confronting the investor directly, Jennifer developed a third approach. She presented a detailed analysis showing how the company's original mission could be achieved in ways that also satisfied the investor's legitimate concerns about return on investment. She acknowledged his expertise while maintaining confidence in her vision. She created space for him to feel heard while never wavering from her core objectives. The key was recognizing that I didn't have to choose between being effective and being authentic, Jennifer explained.
Real strength comes from finding ways to honor both your own truth and others' legitimate needs.
When you try to sacrifice either one, you end up satisfying neither. Authentic intelligence requires developing what psychologists call differentiated self, the ability to maintain clear boundaries between one's own thoughts, feelings, and goals and those of others. This capacity allows individuals to remain empathetic and responsive to others without losing their own center. The development of authentic intelligence often involves a period of apparent regression, where individuals must temporarily become less effective at getting what they want from others while they learn to operate from genuine rather than strategic motives. This transition can be particularly challenging for those who have achieved success through psychological manipulation or people-pleasing. Marcus experienced this challenge when he decided to abandon his more manipulative approaches to leadership in favor of authentic influence. Initially, his effectiveness seemed to decline as he stopped using tactics that had previously served him well. Some colleagues interpreted his new approach as weakness, and several projects that might have succeeded through manipulation failed when he insisted on more honest methods. I had to learn to tolerate short-term ineffectiveness in service of long-term integrity, Marcus explained. It was like learning to walk again after becoming very skilled at crawling. The new approach was ultimately more powerful, but it required developing completely different muscles. The psychological foundation of authentic intelligence involves what philosophers call existential courage, the willingness to take responsibility for one's own choices and their consequences without seeking validation or permission from others. This courage allows individuals to pursue their authentic goals even when those goals are not popular or immediately understood by others. Authentic intelligence also requires developing sophisticated emotional regulation skills. Individuals at this stage must be able to remain calm and clear-headed when others are attempting to trigger emotional reactions. They must be able to feel empathy for others' struggles without taking responsibility for solving problems that others need to solve for themselves. They must be able to maintain confidence in their vision even when facing criticism or apparent setbacks. The practical manifestations of authentic intelligence are often subtle but profound. Authentic leaders tend to attract followers who are genuinely committed rather than merely compliant. They create environments where others feel permission to be authentic as well, which leads to higher levels of creativity and engagement. They make decisions based on long-term vision rather than short-term approval, which often leads to better outcomes even when the path is more challenging. However, authentic intelligence can become a limitation if it leads to inflexibility or self-righteousness. Some individuals at this stage become so committed to their authentic vision that they lose the ability to adapt to changing circumstances or to learn from others whose perspectives differ from their own. Stage 6, Adaptive Intelligence, the fluidity of power. The sixth stage of intelligence involves the ability to adapt fluidly to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles and objectives. Individuals at this level understand that rigid adherence to any single approach, even an authentic one, can become a limitation in dynamic environments. They develop what might be called principled flexibility, the capacity to change tactics, strategies, and even personality presentation while never compromising fundamental values. Alexander Kim embodied this intelligence during his leadership of a multinational corporation through a period of dramatic market disruption. When digital technologies began threatening traditional business models across his industry, Alexander recognized that survival would require not just adapting to change, but becoming an agent of transformation.
However, the challenge was not merely strategic but cultural. The company had built its success on deep expertise in traditional methods, and many employees and investors viewed the necessary changes as threats to everything they valued about the organization. Alexander needed to lead a transformation that honored the company's heritage while completely reimagining its future. I realized that I needed to become different people for different stakeholders while never losing sight of the core mission, Alexander explained. With traditional employees, I emphasized continuity and evolution. With digital natives, I emphasized innovation and disruption. With investors, I emphasized both risk management and growth potential. But, underneath all these presentations was the same fundamental commitment to creating value for all stakeholders. Adaptive intelligence requires developing what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch between different mental frameworks and approaches as circumstances require. This capacity goes beyond mere tactical adjustment to include fundamental shifts in thinking patterns and problem-solving approaches. The development of adaptive intelligence involves recognizing that consistency is often overrated as a leadership virtue. While core principles should remain stable, the expression of those principles must evolve continuously in response to changing contexts. This requires abandoning the ego-driven need to be right about specific approaches in favor of the deeper commitment to achieving authentic objectives. Marcus discovered this principle during a period when his company faced unexpected competition from a much larger organization with significantly greater resources. His initial response was to compete directly using the same strategies that had brought previous success. However, it quickly became apparent that this approach would lead to certain defeat. I had to completely reimagine what success looked like, Marcus recalled. Instead of trying to outcompete them in areas where they had natural advantages, I focused on creating unique value that made competition irrelevant. This required abandoning approaches that had defined my leadership style for years. The solution involved partnering with the competitor in some areas while differentiating in others, a strategy that initially felt like surrender but ultimately created more value for everyone involved. The experience taught Marcus that adaptive intelligence often requires embracing apparent contradictions and paradoxes. Adaptive intelligence also involves developing sophisticated timing awareness. Individuals at this stage understand that the same action can produce completely different results depending on when it is taken. They develop intuitive sensitivity to organizational and market rhythms, knowing when to advance and when to retreat, when to speak and when to listen, when to lead and when to follow. The psychological foundation of adaptive intelligence involves what researchers call tolerance for ambiguity, the ability to function effectively in situations where information is incomplete, outcomes are uncertain, and multiple contradictory approaches may all have merit. This tolerance allows adaptive leaders to experiment with new approaches without being paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. However, adaptive intelligence contains its own potential limitations. Individuals at this stage can become so focused on flexibility and responsiveness that they lose connection to stable principles and long-term vision. They may develop a chameleon-like quality that others find difficult to trust because it seems unpredictable or manipulative. Stage 7, Intuitive Intelligence. Beyond rational analysis, the seventh stage of intelligence involves developing access to forms of knowing that transcend rational analysis. Individuals at this level learn to trust insights that arise from sources they cannot fully explain or justify through logical reasoning. This stage represents a crucial transition from intelligence as analytical capacity to intelligence as comprehensive awareness. Maria Santos exemplified this level during her leadership of a research and development organization facing a series of technical challenges that had stumped teams of brilliant engineers and scientists. The problems were not just complex but seemed to require breakthrough insights that could not be achieved through systematic analysis alone. Maria's approach was to create environments where intuitive insights were more likely to emerge. She instituted practices such as silent reflection periods during meetings, walking meetings in natural settings, and collaborative sessions that emphasized exploration rather than problem solving. She also modeled the willingness to act on hunches and insights that could not be fully justified through data analysis. I learned that rational analysis is incredibly powerful for solving known types of problems, but breakthrough innovations often require leaps of insight that transcend logical reasoning, Maria explained. The challenge is learning to trust these insights while still maintaining rigorous evaluation of their practical implications. The results were remarkable. Teams began generating innovative solutions that had not emerged through traditional analytical approaches. Projects that had been stalled for months suddenly found new directions. The organization developed a reputation for innovative thinking that attracted both talent and investment. Intuitive intelligence requires developing what neuroscientists call right brain processing, the capacity to perceive patterns, relationships, and possibilities that are not immediately apparent to analytical thinking. This type of processing involves synthesizing vast amounts of information below the threshold of conscious awareness and, then, presenting the results as sudden insights or gut feelings. The development of intuitive intelligence often requires individuals to overcome their attachment to being able to explain and justify every decision through rational analysis. This can be particularly challenging for highly educated individuals who have built their identity around analytical thinking and who may view intuitive approaches as unscientific or unprofessional. Marcus experienced this challenge when he began incorporating intuitive insights into his decision-making process. His analytical training had taught him to mistrust any conclusion that could not be supported through data and logical reasoning. However, he began to notice that his most successful decisions often involved elements that he could not fully justify at the time they were made. I started paying attention to what I called informed hunches, insights that arose from deep familiarity with complex situations even when I couldn't articulate exactly why I was seeing things a particular way, Marcus explained. I learned to use these insights as starting points for investigation rather than dismissing them because I couldn't immediately prove them. Intuitive intelligence also involves developing sensitivity to what might be called field effects, subtle changes in group dynamics, market conditions, or organizational cultures that are not yet apparent through conventional analysis. Individuals at this stage often report knowing that something important is about to happen before they have concrete evidence to support this knowledge. The practical applications of intuitive intelligence are particularly valuable in situations involving high complexity, rapid change, or human psychology. Traditional analytical approaches often fail in these contexts because they cannot process the vast amounts of interconnected variables quickly enough to generate timely insights. However, intuitive intelligence must be balanced with rigorous evaluation to avoid the pitfalls of wishful thinking, projection, and confirmation bias. The most effective practitioners of intuitive intelligence use their insights as hypotheses to be tested rather than as final truths to be implemented without question. The limitation of intuitive intelligence, when not properly grounded, is that it can lead to decisions based on personal psychology rather than actual insight. Individuals may mistake their own fears, desires, or prejudices for intuitive guidance, leading to poor decisions that are defended as being based on higher knowing. Stage 8. Integrated intelligence, the synthesis of all capacities. The eighth stage of intelligence represents the integration of all previous levels into a seamless whole. Individuals at this stage can access reactive awareness when immediate response is needed, proactive planning when systematic action is required, strategic thinking when leverage is important, psychological insight when human dynamics are crucial, authentic expression when integrity is paramount, adaptive flexibility when change is necessary, and intuitive guidance when breakthrough thinking is required. Thomas Chen demonstrated this integration during his leadership of a complex international merger between companies from different cultures, industries, and regulatory environments. The project required simultaneously managing financial details, cultural sensitivities, regulatory compliance, stakeholder relationships, timing considerations, and strategic positioning. Rather than approaching these challenges as separate problems requiring different solutions, Thomas recognized them as interconnected aspects of a single complex system. His approach involved flowing seamlessly between different levels of intelligence as the situation required, sometimes within the same conversation or meeting. I realized that each level of intelligence I had developed was like a different sense organ, Thomas explained. Just as you don't choose between seeing and hearing, you use both simultaneously to understand your environment. I learned to use all my different capacities simultaneously to understand complex situations. During negotiations with regulatory agencies, Thomas combined strategic analysis of legal requirements with psychological insight into the concerns driving the regulations, adaptive flexibility in finding creative compliance approaches, and authentic communication about his company's genuine intentions. When cultural conflicts arose between merger teams, he used intuitive sensitivity to understand underlying dynamics while applying practical problem-solving skills to develop workable solutions. Integrated intelligence involves what systems theorists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe one's own thinking processes and consciously choose which mental approaches to apply to specific situations. This capacity allows individuals to optimize their cognitive resources and to avoid the common trap of applying familiar approaches to situations that require different types of thinking. The development of integrated intelligence requires extensive practice and usually emerges only after individuals have achieved mastery at all previous levels. It cannot be forced or accelerated through technique alone, as it represents a natural evolution that occurs when earlier stages have been fully integrated. Marcus achieved this integration during his most challenging leadership assignment, turning around a failing division while simultaneously managing his company's expansion into emerging markets. The situation required constant switching between different types of intelligence, often multiple times within a single day. I stopped thinking about which approach to use and started feeling into what each situation required, Marcus reflected. It became like dancing. You don't think about individual steps, you respond to the music and your partner's movements with your whole being. Integrated intelligence also involves developing what might be called dynamic wisdom, the ability to apply appropriate levels of intervention to different situations. Sometimes problems require direct action, sometimes strategic maneuvering, sometimes patient waiting, and sometimes complete redefinition of the situation. Individuals with integrated intelligence develop intuitive sensitivity to these different requirements. The practical manifestations of integrated intelligence are often subtle but powerful. Integrated leaders tend to generate consistently excellent results across diverse situations without apparent effort. They seem to know instinctively how to motivate different individuals, how to time their interventions, and how to navigate complex political and strategic landscapes. However, integrated intelligence can become a limitation if it leads to overconfidence or if it creates distance from others who are operating at less integrated levels. Some individuals at this stage become impatient with others' more limited approaches or lose the ability to communicate effectively with those who have not developed similar capacities. Stage 9. Transcendent intelligence. Beyond personal ambition, the ninth stage of intelligence involves transcending personal ambition in favor of serving purposes larger than individual success. Individuals at this level continue to achieve remarkable results, but their motivation shifts from personal advancement to contribution to collective well-being. This shift paradoxically often leads to even greater personal success, but success becomes a byproduct rather than the primary objective. Catherine Lee exemplified this transition during her evolution from a successful entrepreneur to a leader focused on addressing systemic social challenges. Her first company had achieved significant financial success through innovative technology solutions, but Catherine found herself increasingly motivated by questions of how business could serve broader human flourishing. I realized that all my previous success felt somehow hollow, Catherine explained. I had achieved everything I thought I wanted, but I felt like I was using my capabilities for purposes that were ultimately trivial compared to the real challenges facing humanity. Catherine's next venture focused on developing technologies that could address poverty in developing nations. The project required all the intelligence and skills she had developed in her previous business success, but applied to challenges that were far more complex and less immediately profitable. The transition was not simply a matter of changing focus from profit to purpose. It required developing new forms of intelligence that could handle the complexity of systemic social problems while maintaining the effectiveness needed to create actual change rather than merely good intentions. Transcendent intelligence involves what philosophers call post-conventional moral reasoning, the ability to make decisions based on universal principles rather than personal benefit or social approval. This capacity allows individuals to pursue objectives that may be unpopular or temporarily disadvantageous while serving larger purposes. The development of transcendent intelligence often begins with what psychologists call existential crisis, a period where individual success loses its meaning and individuals begin questioning the ultimate purpose of their efforts. This crisis can be deeply disorienting, as it challenges the motivational structures that have previously driven achievement. Marcus experienced this transition after achieving most of the conventional markers of success he had originally pursued. Despite his accomplishments, he found himself feeling increasingly empty and
questioning whether his efforts were contributing to anything meaningful beyond his own advancement. I had become very good at winning games that I realized I didn't really care about, Marcus reflected. The challenge was learning to identify and pursue objectives that would remain meaningful even after I achieved them. The solution involved expanding his definition of success to include measures of contribution rather than just measures of acquisition. Marcus began evaluating opportunities based on their potential to create lasting value for all stakeholders rather than focusing primarily on personal benefit. Transcendent intelligence also involves developing what might be called systems consciousness awareness of how individual actions contribute to larger patterns and outcomes. Individuals at this stage recognize that personal success achieved at the expense of systemic health is ultimately self-defeating, even from a purely selfish perspective. The practical applications of transcendent intelligence often involve taking on challenges that are too complex or long-term for most individuals or organizations to address effectively. Transcendent leaders tend to work on problems that may not be fully solved within their lifetimes but that represent important contributions to human progress. However, transcendent intelligence can become a limitation if it leads to self-righteousness or if it creates such high standards that practical action becomes impossible. Some individuals at this stage become so focused on ultimate purposes that they lose effectiveness in dealing with immediate practical requirements. The 10th and final stage of intelligence involves the recognition that individual intelligence is actually an expression of a larger intelligence that operates through all beings and systems. Individuals who reach this stage continue to function as effective leaders and decision-makers, but they do so from a fundamentally different understanding of identity and purpose. They recognize themselves as instruments of a larger intelligence rather than as separate entities trying to impose their will upon the world. Daniel Kim exemplified this level during his leadership of a global initiative to address climate change through technological innovation and international cooperation. The challenges involved were beyond the capacity of any individual or organization to solve alone, requiring unprecedented levels of collaboration between governments, corporations, scientific institutions, and civil society organizations. I realized that the problem was not a lack of individual intelligence or capability, Daniel explained. We had brilliant people working on all aspects of the challenge. The problem was that everyone was trying to solve it from their own limited perspective. The breakthrough came when I stopped trying to be the person with the solution and started creating conditions for the solution to emerge from the collective intelligence of everyone involved. Daniel's approach involved creating forums where different stakeholders could share their perspectives and insights without trying to advocate for predetermined positions. He facilitated processes that allowed new possibilities to emerge from the interaction of different viewpoints rather than trying to synthesize existing positions into compromise solutions. The results were remarkable. Solutions emerged that none of the participants could have conceived individually. New partnerships formed that created possibilities none of the organizations could have achieved alone. Technologies were developed that combined insights from fields that had never previously collaborated. Universal intelligence involves what mystics have called ego dissolution, not the elimination of individual personality and capability, but the recognition that individual consciousness is a local expression of a larger consciousness that connects all beings. This recognition allows individuals to access insights and capabilities that transcend their personal knowledge and experience. The development of universal intelligence typically occurs only after individuals have achieved mastery at all previous levels and have begun to exhaust the possibilities of individual striving. It often begins with experiences where individuals recognize that their best insights and decisions seem to come from somewhere beyond their personal thinking. Marcus encountered this stage during a period when he was simultaneously managing several complex international projects while also dealing with significant personal challenges. He found that his most effective decisions were emerging during moments when he was not actively trying to figure out what to do. I began to notice that the harder I tried to solve problems through thinking, the more complex and difficult they became, Marcus observed. But, when I could create space for solutions to emerge naturally, the right approach would often become obvious without effort. This recognition led Marcus to experiment with different approaches to leadership and decision-making. Instead of trying to be the source of solutions, he began creating conditions where solutions could emerge from the collective intelligence of his teams and organizations.
Universal intelligence involves developing what might be called participatory awareness, the recognition that individual consciousness participates in a larger intelligence rather than being separate from it. This awareness allows individuals to access resources and insights that are not available through personal thinking alone. The practical applications of universal intelligence are often characterized by what observers describe as effortless effectiveness. Individuals operating at this level seem to accomplish remarkable results without apparent struggle or force. They tend to be in the right place at the right time with remarkable consistency. They attract resources and support in ways that seem almost magical to those operating at lower levels of intelligence. However, this stage is not characterized by passivity or lack of engagement. Universal intelligence involves highly skillful action, but action that arises from deep listening and responsiveness rather than from personal agenda and effort. Individuals at this stage often work harder and longer than others, but from a place of flow and inspiration rather than struggle and stress. The man who destroys his weak self. The journey through these 10 stages of intelligence represents nothing less than the systematic destruction and reconstruction of human identity. Each stage requires abandoning previously held beliefs about the nature of reality, success, and personal power. Each transition involves a death of sorts, the death of who one thought one was in favor of who one is capable of becoming. This process of conscious self-destruction is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of genuine leadership development. Most people imagine that growth involves adding new capabilities to existing personality structures. In reality, authentic transformation requires dismantling the psychological patterns that created previous limitations. Marcus understood this principle viscerally as he reflected on his own journey from reactive employee to someone operating at the highest levels of organizational and social influence. Each stage of his development had required releasing attachments to approaches that had previously defined his identity. I had to die as the person who needed approval from authority figures in order to be born as someone who could create his own standards of excellence, Marcus reflected. I had to die as someone who solved problems through individual effort in order to become someone who could mobilize collective intelligence. I had to die as someone motivated by personal advancement in order to become someone motivated by contribution to purposes larger than myself. The psychological resistance to this process is enormous. Human beings naturally seek to preserve existing identity structures, even when those structures are limiting or destructive. The ego mind creates elaborate justifications for why change is unnecessary, impossible, or dangerous. It generates fears of loss, failure, and abandonment that can paralyze individuals at the threshold of transformation. The key insight that allows individuals to navigate this resistance is recognizing that what appears to be self-destruction is actually the revelation of a more authentic and powerful self that was always present but obscured by limiting patterns. The weak self that must be destroyed is not the true self but a collection of defensive strategies, social conditioning, and fear-based beliefs that masquerade as identity. This recognition requires developing what might be called existential courage, the willingness to release what is familiar and comfortable in favor of what is authentic and possible. This courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to act in alignment with truth despite fear. The process of conscious self-destruction also requires developing sophisticated discernment about which aspects of personality and behavior serve authentic purposes and which serve only to protect limiting beliefs. This discernment develops through careful self-observation and honest feedback from trusted others who have themselves undertaken similar journeys. Marcus had learned to identify limiting patterns by paying attention to situations where he felt defensive, reactive, or effortful. These emotional signals indicated areas where his weak self was attempting to maintain control through outdated strategies. I realized that any area of my life where I was struggling or forcing was an area where some aspect of my weak self was still trying to run the show, Marcus explained. Real power flows naturally from authentic action. Struggle is usually a sign that you're trying to accomplish something in a way that contradicts your true nature. The destruction of the weak self is not a one-time event but an ongoing process that continues throughout the development journey. Each stage of intelligence requires releasing additional layers of limiting identity in favor of expanded capacity and awareness. The invincible nature of the transformed self. The individual who has successfully navigated the destruction of limiting patterns and the development of higher levels of intelligence becomes essentially invulnerable to external attacks or circumstances. This invulnerability is not based on avoiding challenges but on developing the internal resources to transform any challenge into an opportunity for further growth and contribution. This transformation occurs because such individuals no longer derive their sense of identity or security from external circumstances. Their center of gravity has shifted from dependency on approval, control, or specific outcomes to commitment to authentic expression and service to larger purposes. Maria Santos exemplified this invulnerability during a period when her organization faced coordinated attacks from competitors who used both legal and public relations strategies to undermine her company's credibility and market position. Rather than becoming defensive or reactive, Maria used the attacks as opportunities to clarify her organization's values and to demonstrate its commitment to ethical business practices. I realized that their attacks could only harm me if I allowed them to move me away from authentic action, Maria explained. When you're operating from authentic purpose, opposition actually strengthens your position because it forces you to become more clear and more skillful in expressing your truth. The attacks ultimately served to differentiate Maria's organization from its competitors and to attract customers and employees who valued ethical leadership. What was intended to destroy her company actually accelerated its growth and market leadership. This dynamic illustrates a fundamental principle of transformed intelligence. External circumstances can only limit individuals who are internally dependent on those circumstances for their sense of identity or security. When individuals develop internal sources of fulfillment and direction, external pressures become raw material for further development rather than threats to be avoided. The invulnerability that emerges from authentic transformation is not arrogance or indifference to consequences. Transformed individuals continue to care deeply about outcomes and to work skillfully to achieve their objectives. However, their emotional well-being and sense of self-worth are not dependent on specific results. This emotional freedom allows transformed individuals to take risks that others cannot take, to persist through challenges that others cannot endure, and to maintain clarity and creativity under pressure that would paralyze less developed individuals. Marcus discovered this principle during a period when his company faced potential bankruptcy due to economic conditions beyond his control. Rather than being overwhelmed by fear or desperation, Marcus found himself energized by the challenge and able to access creative solutions that had not been apparent during easier times. I realized that my fear was not really about losing the company, Marcus reflected. My fear was about what losing the company would mean about me as a person. Once I separated my identity from my circumstances, I could think clearly about what was actually possible. The solutions that emerged during this crisis ultimately positioned the company for greater success than it had achieved during supposedly favorable conditions. The experience taught Marcus that challenges often contain hidden opportunities that are only visible to those who are not overwhelmed by fear or attachment to specific outcomes. The integration of power and service. The ultimate expression of developed intelligence involves the integration of personal power with service to larger purposes. Individuals who reach this integration discover that these apparently contradictory objectives are actually complementary aspects of the same commitment to authentic expression and effective action. This integration resolves one of the fundamental tensions that limits many intelligent and capable individuals: the conflict between developing personal power and serving others. Many people assume that these objectives are mutually exclusive, leading them to either pursue power at others' expense or to sacrifice their own development in service to others. Transformed intelligence reveals that genuine service to others requires the development of all one's capabilities, while genuine power can only be sustained when it serves purposes larger than personal advancement. This recognition allows individuals to pursue their own development with complete commitment while simultaneously contributing to collective well-being. Catherine Lee embodied this integration through her leadership of initiatives that simultaneously advanced her own development and contributed to addressing global challenges. Her work required her to continuously develop new capabilities and to take on greater responsibilities, while also creating technologies and systems that served populations who could never provide direct personal benefit to her. I discovered that the more completely I developed my own capabilities, the more I could contribute to solving important problems, Catherine explained. And the more I focused on serving important purposes, the more rapidly I developed capabilities I never knew I had.
This dynamic creates a positive feedback loop where personal development and service to others reinforce each other rather than competing for time and energy. Individuals operating from this integration often achieve remarkable results in both domains simultaneously. The integration of power and service also resolves the psychological conflicts that plague many capable individuals who feel guilty about their success or their desire for influence and achievement. When power is understood as the capacity to serve effectively rather than the ability to control others, its development becomes a moral imperative rather than a selfish indulgence. Marcus achieved this integration when he recognized that his desire for influence and his commitment to contribution were expressions of the same fundamental drive toward authentic expression and effective action. This recognition allowed him to pursue positions of greater responsibility and influence without guilt or ambivalence. I stopped seeing power and service as different objectives and started seeing them as different aspects of the same commitment to making the most positive impact I could make, Marcus explained. This shift eliminated a lot of internal conflict and allowed me to focus completely on developing whatever capabilities were needed to serve most effectively. The ripple effects of transformation. The individual who completes this journey of conscious self-destruction and reconstruction becomes a catalyst for similar transformations in others. This influence occurs not through deliberate efforts to change others but through the natural impact of authentic expression and effective action. People are naturally drawn to individuals who operate with clarity, capability, and commitment to purposes larger than personal advantage. This attraction creates opportunities for transformed individuals to model different possibilities and to create environments where others can undertake their own development journeys. The influence of transformed individuals often extends far beyond their direct relationships and responsibilities. Their decisions and actions create ripple effects that influence organizational cultures, market dynamics, and social norms in ways that support the development of intelligence and consciousness in others. Daniel Kim experienced this phenomenon through his work on global challenges, where his approach to creating collaborative solutions inspired similar approaches in other organizations and sectors. The methods he developed for accessing collective intelligence were adapted and implemented by leaders in various fields, creating a multiplier effect that extended far beyond his direct involvement. I realized that the most important contribution I could make was not solving specific problems but demonstrating approaches that others could use to solve their own problems, Daniel explained. When you show people what's possible, they develop their own capacity to access those possibilities. This ripple effect occurs because transformation at higher levels of intelligence tends to be contagious. When people experience environments where authentic expression is welcomed, where collective intelligence is accessed, and where individual development serves larger purposes, they naturally begin to develop these capacities themselves. The ultimate impact of an individual's transformation journey therefore extends far beyond personal achievement to include contribution to the evolution of consciousness and capability in human organizations and societies. The continuous journey, the development of intelligence through these 10 stages, is not a linear progression that ends with the achievement of universal intelligence. Each stage must be continually deepened and refined through ongoing practice and application. Higher stages do not eliminate the need for capabilities developed at earlier stages but rather integrate them into more sophisticated and comprehensive approaches. Marcus understood that his development would continue throughout his lifetime, with each new challenge requiring further refinement of his capacities and deeper integration of all the levels of intelligence he had accessed. I used to think of development as reaching a destination, Marcus reflected. Now I understand it as an ongoing process of becoming more capable of serving whatever purposes require my contribution. The journey never ends, but it becomes continuously more interesting and fulfilling. The man who destroys his weak self and develops authentic intelligence becomes truly indestructible not because he avoids challenges but because he has developed the capacity to transform any challenge into an opportunity for further growth and contribution. His power lies not in controlling external circumstances but in his ability to respond to any circumstances with creativity, courage, and commitment to purposes larger than personal survival or advancement. This transformation represents the ultimate expression of human potential, the development of individuals who can think clearly, act effectively, influence wisely, and contribute meaningfully to the collective challenges and opportunities facing humanity. Such individuals become living demonstrations that human beings can transcend the limitations of reactive thinking, defensive behavior, and narrow self-interest in favor of authentic expression and service to the larger intelligence that seeks to evolve through human consciousness and capability. The journey from reactive follower to transformed leader represents nothing less than the conscious evolution of human consciousness itself. Each individual who undertakes this journey contributes not only to their own development but to the development of human potential itself. In destroying their weak self, they reveal and strengthen the authentic self that has always been present, waiting to serve purposes worthy of human intelligence, creativity, and commitment. In the end, the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has become aligned with forces larger and more permanent than any individual opposition or circumstance. He has become an instrument of the intelligence that seeks to express itself through human consciousness, and that intelligence is truly indestructible.